Close your eyes for a moment. Picture an 80-year-old grandmother. Imagine her physicality. Her back perhaps slightly bent by the weight of age, her hair turned gray by time. Now take that image and place her alone in a vast, cold field, surrounded by thousands of soldiers who are all screaming for her blood. In the autumn of 613, in what is now eastern France, this was the terrifying reality for Queen Brunhilda. After ruling kingdoms for nearly half a century, she wasn't just facing execution, she was facing a nightmare. She was staring down the barrel of 3 days of state-sanctioned torture, followed by one of the most horrifying deaths ever inflicted on a royal figure in human history. Her captors shouted that her crime was the death of 10 Frankish kings. But historians, looking back through the dust of centuries, know the truth. Her real crime wasn't murder. Her real crime was being an ambitious woman in a world that fundamentally refused to forgive female power. And what they did to her next is almost impossible to believe. Now, usually, when we hear the word trial, we think of evidence, a defense attorney, maybe a judge sitting behind a bench. But let's be real, what happened in that field was pure political theater. The victor, King Clothar II, had already decided she was going to die long before she arrived in chains. He just needed a show to justify it. He needed a spectacle. Standing before the entire army, this nearly 80-year-old woman was forced to listen to accusations that were frankly insane, even by the brutal standards of the Middle Ages. Clothar accused Brunhilda of being responsible for the deaths of 10 separate Frankish kings. Think about that number for a second. 10! The list was grotesque and desperate. He blamed her for the death of her own husband, Sigebert, the man she loved, whose murder had actually sparked her 40-year quest for revenge. He blamed her for his own father's mysterious stabbing. He even blamed her for the death of her second husband. Sure, there were grains of truth. Brunhilda was a politician in the Dark Ages. She had ordered assassinations. She had been ruthless. But Clothar was pinning every natural death, every battlefield casualty, and every political murder of the last half-century squarely on her shoulders. Why go to this trouble? Why the elaborate lies? Because Clothar had a massive PR problem. He was about to torture an elderly grandmother, his own relative, to death. To make that look like justice instead of sadistic cruelty, he had to paint her as a monster. He had to convince his soldiers that she wasn't a queen, but a witch who had cursed their lands. And the army? They cheered. This is where the story reveals something incredibly dark about the time. Frankish kings murdered their rivals constantly. It was just business as usual. But Brunhilda's crime wasn't just violence. It was that she dared to wield that violence while being a woman. She had stepped into a man's arena and played by their rules better than they did. She offered no defense that survived history. Perhaps she knew it was useless. She stood silent. The sentence was pronounced. And with that, the political theater ended and 3 days of absolute horror began. What followed wasn't just punishment, it was a calculated ritual designed to pulverize her spirit before they finally broke her body. For 3 full days, the army that had once feared her orders was invited to watch her suffer.
The centerpiece of this humiliation? A detail so specific and bizarre that historical chronicles made sure to record it. The camel. They didn't just walk her through the camp. They bound this 80-year-old former queen to the back of a camel, an exotic, awkward beast that most Frankish soldiers had never even seen before. The animal's lurching, uneven gait was designed to be physically agonizing for her battered body, but the psychological impact was even worse. They paraded her through the ranks like a carnival freak. Thousands of soldiers, men who had taken orders from her appointees just weeks ago, now jeered, spat, and threw refuse at her. Why the sudden switch? Because mocking her was the safest way to prove loyalty to the new king. By laughing at her degradation, they were signaling to Clothar that they were part of the new order. Between these public parades, she was likely thrown into confinement. Imagine the cold autumn nights, no food, untreated wounds, forced to listen to the sounds of the soldiers celebrating her downfall just outside her cell. But here is the detail that truly chills the blood. She stayed conscious. Her torturers were skilled. They knew exactly how far to push without letting her die or pass out. They wanted her to feel every second of the fall from most powerful woman in Europe to helpless prisoner. By the end of the third day, she was broken, starving, and humiliated. But she was still alive. And that's exactly what Clothar wanted. He was saving the worst for last. On the fourth day, as the sun rose over Renev, the slow torture finally stopped. But the violence was about to accelerate.
Clothar had chosen a method of execution that was shocking even by medieval standards: death by wild horse. They brought Brunhilda out one last time. According to the Chronicle of Friedegar, they didn't just tie her hands. They wove her long gray hair, one arm and one leg, to the tail of a horse. But this wasn't a disciplined war horse they used. It was an unbroken, wild stallion, powerful, terrified, and completely unpredictable. When they released the animal, it didn't just trot away, it bolted. The terror of the shouting soldiers and the heavy weight dragging behind it sent the horse into a panicked gallop. The physics of what happened next are horrific. Brunhilda was instantly ripped from her feet. As the horse careened through the camp, her body was dragged at full speed over terrain studded with sharp rocks, roots, and hard earth. The executioners had tied the knots with expert precision to ensure they wouldn't break. They wanted to prolong the inevitable. The historical sources describe the result as catastrophic. The horse covered a massive distance, thundering across the uneven ground, literally shattering the woman who had once built the roads and fortresses of Europe. By the time the horse was finally caught and brought to a halt, the queen was gone. What remained in the dust was barely recognizable as human. You might think that was the end, but Clothar had one final insult left. He didn't want a martyr. He didn't want a grave where loyalists could gather to pay respects, so he ordered her broken remains to be gathered and thrown into a fire. She was reduced to ash and scattered to the wind. It was an act of total erasure, an attempt to delete her 50 years of rule from history as if she had never existed at all. This execution marked the end of the civil wars. Clothar II became the first king to unite all the Frankish kingdoms since 561. He got his crown and he got his empire, but the foundation of his new reign was built on the ashes of his aunt. So here is the question history leaves us with. Knowing what you know now, was this justice for a ruthless political leader who had killed to stay in power? Or was this something darker, an act of extreme misogynistic cruelty designed to make an example of a woman who refused to surrender? The ruins of medieval Francia still stand today, scattered across the landscape she once commanded. But her true monument isn't made of stone. It's the horrifying story of how she fell, a reminder of the brutal price of power in the Dark Ages.